Hello and welcome back. It's Rob Chadwick here and Nick Copson and Bill Martin, and we're here to do our second episode of Journalism, yet to be named. We must discuss that at some point, boys. And what we're going to talk about today is the funding of journalism. We will talk about local news again because we had some stuff left undiscussed from the last episode, but we did want to broaden it a little bit more to basically national newspapers, etc., etc. And I think we should just start by, I think, Nick, talk us through the old model of funding for newspapers.
Well, the old model is probably not a lot dissimilar to how it's funded at the moment, although funded to a lot less. The old model is essentially cover price, the money you pay to buy a copy, either through subscription or at the counter, which obviously is going up as inflation does, but I think it's beating inflation, or worse than inflation, whichever way you look at it. So that's where I don't know what the percentage is, maybe Bill, but that's where a large part of the revenue comes from. But then the rest, of course, quite simply is through ad revenue.
And who used to advertise in newspapers?
Well, who didn't? Is probably the question. I mean, there was
just about everybody.
Just about everybody. But not only the local newspapers, my area of expertise, they would be packed full of births, deaths, and marriages. So all those sort of small personal ads it was the only place to sort of announce either a death or a marriage or a birth. I mean, sometimes that would run to 2 or 3 pages. They weren't cheap in those times to take adverts like that. And there were different days of the weeks. Each paper, papers would have platforms specifically designed to attract advertising. So Motors was Friday, Homes was on Thursday. It depended. In its heyday on the Herald, we had so much property advertising.
I remember there being whole sections in the middle of the paper.
Yeah, whole sections. And at some point, the press wasn't big enough to print the Herald and the property section together, so we had to print them separately and then insert the property section into that. So
with every estate agent, basically, and they probably all felt they had to because otherwise they would miss out on business. It was basically be in that paper or you were.
It's quite funny, isn't it? I mean, looking back, we're only talking 15 years, really, aren't we? Maybe 20 at the most.
Yeah,
this was pretty much the only place you could get this information.
Yeah,
perhaps buying and selling
the shop window.
Yeah, buying and selling cars. Maybe there were specialist mags, really, but if you wanted a job, you had to get the local paper
on a Wednesday.
Yeah, if you wanted to buy a house, or you'd have to get the local paper. I mean, it's incredible that those markets have been lost, really.
So
startling.
Yeah. So who advertises now?
Well, you only have to buy a copy and have a look. And, the actual volume of display advertising in most local papers now is low. And most of that, what you do see is national brand advertising. So some supermarkets or national brand telephone companies, things like that.
I notice a lot of supermarket advertising when we're doing revenue models within the subject. I teach journalism up at Exeter College, and I do notice a lot of supermarket advertising and a lot of special offer type advertising for supermarkets as well.
Yeah, and in the run up to a bank holiday, you'll see lots of
alcohol going cheap.
Yeah, alcohol going cheap in supermarkets, and that'll be centrally sold across the whole stable of newspapers. And it's not just in papers that you see it. You'll see exactly the same or hear exactly the same on local radio. But I think the days when you had large numbers of local advertisers paying significant amounts of money for large-scale display advertising in print or on local radio, those days are long gone, really. That you could probably count on the fingers of one hand local advertisers using those platforms now.
Feels like it's a much harder job selling that advertising nowadays. I bet I wouldn't fancy being a salesperson trying to sell those adverts nowadays.
No.
Yeah. So that's the model now. And what's the limitations of that, and how do we expand that so that newspapers can continue in the future and still make money? Is it going to have to be an online only model, or is it going to still incorporate some newspapers and stuff? I presume advertising has to be both online relevant and in newspaper relevant, and probably more online than it is newspaper for the actual paper itself. Can we generate enough advertising revenue to continue with physical newspapers still being distributed?
I suspect not, right? But and that's just my immediate response to your question, Rob. I suspect not. There's not enough advertisers, as Bill talks about, locally that are willing to pay the rates. I think that in comparison to the response, if you're advertising, you want response. That means people taking action against your message. There's not enough response from those because of the circulation. The readership of those newspapers is dropping and dropping and dropping. I think the latest I got was that the collective circulation decline year on year on all regional newspapers this year is 17% year on year.
So what do you think the timescale is? That do you think in 10 years' time I'll still be able to go into a shop and buy a newspaper?
I would suggest not, but hard to tell. Go back to I think on a previous episode, Bill, you said about, what did you say about the tombstones of America's?
Newspaper Death Watch.
Yeah. So I read a similar report. I think this report was 15 years ago, and it predicted that newspapers, when they die, essentially as a medium in each country, and I think in America it said it was like 2016. And the UK it was 2018, and then it moved like a ripple across Europe, consecutive years. But the reality is they're still here, and that was 6 years after that was predicted.
Was it Oscar Wilde who said reports of my death have been massively exaggerated?
Correct. 10 years is a long time, and that the change in our behaviour and technology is compressed and compressed and compressed, isn't it? I'd be amazed if they were still being printed 10 years from now.
What do you think, Bill?
I'd be amazed if they're still being printed in the same format that they're printed in now. What would I be amazed? I don't know. I think that there will still be some around in some larger urban areas, and probably some more remote rural areas where there are still some stronger weekly publications in areas of the UK where that probably still is quite a relevant form of media. But I think, you can also see, and you'll see it coming through your letterbox, there's a definite uptick as well in what I call one-man band local publications selling £10 ads, which have always been around. I think we might see a re-emergence of models like that, either in print or online, or maybe cooperatively. I'm not sure. But you can definitely see there are more of them around now.
So very, very localised newspapers,
very
which
local,
are produced by maybe one or two people.
Correct, with tiny production costs and varying levels of distribution depending on the area.
I guess the worry with that is that if there's only one or two people involved in it, it could be very, very biased. It could be very, very one-dimensional in the way that it covers things.
Yeah, and in most of the ones that I see now, there's not a lot of actual journalism. There's some content. You can find out what's on at the local theatre and stuff like that. But in terms of old-style, traditional, combative, challenging, authoritative journalism, there's none.
And I guess, from my point of view, that journalism is the important stuff. I read the Sunday Times last week, and this will give you an idea of when we're recording this, but there was an amazing investigation into the finances of the Duchy of Cornwall and basically William and Charles's estates and what they charge all of the people who use the land that they're on. And it's worth millions and millions of pounds. And the amount of research that had gone into that, it must have taken months and months and months of work in order to put that together. There were 5,000 different examples of ways that they charge the population, including the NHS and all sorts of organisations, to use their land. It must have taken ages. That sort of journalism
But
costs
a brilliant
money, doesn't
A
it?
brilliant example. Yeah, it does cost money. It was a brilliant example. I read that piece too. It's a brilliant example of all the techniques of modern day journalism, using where you can find data and public information and everything they'd use to put that piece together. But if you saw the byline, the names of the reporters who were involved in that investigation, it was chunky. I think there was 5 or 6 of them, weren't they? And
It was a joint investigation with Dispatches and the Sunday Times, and there was a lot of journalism involved in it. And my worry is that if the finance model doesn't work, we'll end up with a bunch of list stories like you find on BuzzFeed, the 10 most popular sitcoms of the 90s or something. So just clickbait, basically. And how do we fund journalism that doesn't turn into clickbait?
Well, that's. We sort of touched on it, I think, in the last episode. We talked about, is there hope for local press, and loosely we touched on it, of course. But I feel that if there's a future there for local press, it's got to be focused, and it's got to have a passion, and it's got to have a modus operandi and an ethos and a mission statement that guides it towards its core purpose. And without that, you would probably delve into more is less scenario, I believe, and you might end up in clickbait to achieve an ad revenue number or so on. So
enough traffic through the website,
correct.
basically.
It's got to know its audience. It's got to know its audience, exactly who it's appealing to, who it's writing for, who it's generating content for, and it's got to deliver against a purpose in regard to that. Then you might generate enough of a audience that is willing to part money for that, right? But it's got to be so focused. It's got to be so, unique in its approach that it's delivering something that you just can't get anywhere else. And the danger at the moment is that whatever the local news is doing, you can get it somewhere else.
So it feels like we're moving away from the model we talked about in the last episode, where it was lots and just about everybody in the local population was interested in this newspaper or in this news, to a point where we are saying, actually, if we are going to create intelligent news which is well researched and well documented, there is a limited appeal for that. But if we target those people really well, we can still engage some people with the news as opposed to everybody with the news. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important to remember, there are still local journalists around, and they are still, doing their best in difficult circumstances.
Still some very good ones
around.
and
Some of them doing an incredible job. I don't think anyone so far has solved the sort of platform issues around, where that content's going to be best read and perhaps most appreciated and things like that. And I don't think anyone's come up with a definitive content agenda around, in local communities, or this is what everyone's going to be interested in, blah, blah, blah. And that's never been resolved ever since, the first days when the internet were invented, that different people are interested in different things for short periods of time, probably only when it ever affects them, and that's the thing, which is why you'll see spikes in online traffic, and we used to see spikes in readership. But overall, I think making or developing a future-proof funding model for funding local journalism, it's a tough call. It's a really tough call, and I think that's only going to get harder.
It might take accepting that the audience is always going to be smaller, but targetable in an easier way. So if you know exactly what your audience is, you know exactly who you can sell your advertising to, don't you?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, if you assume for a second that the sport audience has gone to lots of different channels, if you assume that the vertical markets like property and jobs and motors have gone to different channels, which they have, what does that distill down to? What is your...
Who is the audience?
What is your content provision that you could deliver that is perhaps underserved right now, but there is still a market for?
So what do you think? What do you think that there is still a market for local news-wise? I think we can assume that people want their sports news in the moment and can go straight to the Argyle website or the football club that they support's website. And property nowadays, every single estate agent has their own website, etc. So what is the market? Who is going to read local news, and what are they going to read?
Well, solve that one. We're going to be rich.
Well, if you take away what we just discussed, Bill, you've made the point before about the lack of local court reporting. Now that was obviously huge back in the day. Political reporting, perhaps local political interest is dissipating as well anyway. But is there enough local community out there that actually still care? People like your good selves, of course, who would be willing to engage and listen in discourse around that? I suspect so, because it's probably underserved right now.
Yeah, I think to listen and have discourse with it, possibly yes. Is there a large enough market out there who's bothered enough to pay for content like that? I think is debatable.
So is the market to? So every time I go to London, I see people reading the Metro on the tube. They've obviously been giving it for free, but I understand it's a model that works, and they're selling a lot of advertising. Is that the market? Is it get people back? Because by giving it away, people might start being more interested in local news again. Because if they're actually getting something which they've got to have for free, would that work? And then you can sell enough advertising to fund that as a model.
Well, I think important things with the Metro, it's not local in the old traditional sense, is it? It's essentially a sort of mini national paper that they're giving out free. The difference there, though, in London is the massive commuter market, isn't it? They've identified a time in the day, morning and afternoon, when people are sat on the tube or sat on the bus or whatever they're sat on, when they've got nothing to do for 10 minutes. So it's actually a really good idea to hand them something that's very readable. It's very well done, the Metro, isn't it? It's got very simple design. It's easy to read. It's the right size to read at that sort of time, and you can just about read it, on 4 or 5 stops.
Yeah,
on the tube. Happy days.
So we don't think that that's a model that can be kind of moved outside, maybe London, Manchester, Birmingham. It probably works Birmingham as well. There's probably enough commutes in Birmingham and Manchester.
It was definitely tried in Manchester. A similar sort of giving away copies of the Evening News for a long time, and I think that helped sustain the brand for a long time in the city. But it goes back to technological change. It's taken over, isn't it? And handing someone something that's printed on a piece of paper now just seems
alien,
very old-fashioned.
Yeah. Because there's good Wi-Fi on the tube nowadays, yeah. So even the Metro will probably start, because people go, I don't want that, I'll just look at it on my phone. So even that. So coming back to what Nick was saying earlier, 10 years does feel a pretty good time frame for the end of, I would hate, but the end of newspapers, which in a physical form. But then I suppose environmentally that's a good thing, possibly.
Yeah. I had to research, by the way, last night because I haven't bought a newspaper for many a year, I'm ashamed to say, right? I do read national news, of course. I get it through Apple News. I'm a subscriber there, but which is an interesting model in itself. But I haven't bought a local newspaper, and I was amazed to see that the cover price is now £2.15. For the Plymouth Herald in our case. And probably for about 28 pages or something. I don't know what it is, but it's an immense expense on a daily basis.
I think it was about 50p last time I bought it. That's how long ago since I've bought it, I'm afraid. Yeah.
£2.15, 5-6 times a week. It's it just doesn't make any sense, does it? But
especially when actually the content is online free.
Yeah.
Although difficult to use online free.
Correct.
I mean, the Reach website is very difficult to use with pop-ups aplenty and stuff. And so I think there probably still is a way of getting newspapers read unless that model can be, unless the internet model can work in a way which is a much more user-friendly way. Because I don't know about you, but I hate that. Oh, God, I just want to read the story. I don't want to wait for 50 seconds, a minute, to wait for everything to pop up and scroll and et cetera, and videos to play and everything else that goes with trying to access the news on the website nowadays.
Yeah, I'd agree. The model I sometimes look at, and I don't think this would apply to local news, although we're sort of touching on it, is the Athletic Sports website.
It's really good.
Really good, right? I mean, I pay for it, but only through, like as I've just said, Apple News. But if I didn't have Apple News, I'd get a subscription to the Athletic because, well, for a start, the app and the website is really good. But it's about, and going back to the idea of focused product, it's quality. You know, what I discovered over the last 8 or 9 years is that most of the sports coverage in, let's say, national news is fundamentally clickbait. You know, there's spurious kind of headlines that, pull you in, the whole point. But then, you know, you just feel shortchanged after the first 3 paras. You go, sod that, get out. Whereas the Athletic is focused on just proper sport journalism and opinions. Not designed to con you, just designed to inform you and educate you and engage with you. And I'm willing to pay for that.
So that comes back to what I was saying earlier about is the model now to make sort of higher end news content to appeal to those people who are genuinely engaged in the news and to give up on trying to engage with the people who aren't and let them do their top 10 lists.
Yeah.
And what is the effect then on the way people behave within society at that point? Are we basically giving up on a whole tranche of society and saying you can believe what you like, it doesn't matter?
Yeah.
Well, you could argue it the other way round, couldn't you, and say that tranche of society has already done that themselves.
That they've given up already, yeah.
And gave up already and said we're going to believe what we want to believe, or we're going to read what we want to read. That's the key thing. You know, choice, you know, is a beautiful thing, and it's a terrible thing, isn't it? You know, sometimes I quite often find myself saying, I don't want to choose. You know, sometimes I find I can watch 850 TV channels some nights. Some days I'd just wish there was one.
Well, I mean, the 850 TV channels and thousands of radio stations is part of the problem with the funding model anyway, isn't it? There's so many places for the advertisers to put their product, isn't there? So selling it to that one specific place is not necessarily a good thing for their model, isn't it?
Yeah, and you know, they will go where they're either getting visibility or they're getting response. And, you know, you're critical of the Reach websites, but in a sense, websites like that are a product of consumer behaviour, aren't they?
They are.
And, you know, in the absence of having an audience that's not willing to pay for the content they want to read, therefore they've got to live with adverts around their content.
Yeah. And the content seems...
It's utopian, you know, to think that news publishers should be just doing highbrow journalism that nobody wants to read, apart from you and me.
If only everyone was doing the same thing as me, we would all be better off.
Yeah,
I know. But there is a point. There are a lot of people out there who don't trust the MSM, and if journalism becomes about just appealing to people who are interested in journalism, that gap will only get wider. And that leads to things like this summer, a bunch of people going out in Plymouth Town Centre and various town centres around the country and rioting and attacking the police and shouting racist slogans all over the place because they don't trust the messages they're being given by the media. And so it feels to me we do have to try and engage everybody with the mainstream media. How do we stop that, where people are disengaged with journalism because they don't believe anything they read in the mainstream media? How do we get those people back? It would help the funding model, but it would also help society, in my opinion.
But I think, you know, we, being, you know, of a certain generation and have grown up with certain forms of media that we believe in and have trust in, you know, for example, the BBC, local press, that sort of stuff. I think you've got generations of people growing up, and you've seen this in the election in Donald Trump last week, haven't you? there is a new media out there. Like it or lump it, it is out there now. And whether that's social media platforms, whether that's bloggers, whether it's YouTube, there's a whole new force of information out there. It's easy for us to say, "Oh, well, you can't trust it." Well, how do we know? I don't know. I don't know that. There will be in that swamp of publishers. There will be
some grains of truth.
Publishers with integrity.
Yeah. Absolutely,
and I think you probably already, we've already seen that, haven't we? In some of those, the sort of Hollywood reporters and things like that. Quite often they break news about celebrities, and everyone goes, and invariably they're pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So I think it's we could hark back, to the days of saying, "Oh, the world was better when we had newspapers." That everybody read, and it was only one source of media, and the editor, and I was one of them. You were an extraordinarily powerful person in the community at that time. Well, that power now sits with other people, doesn't it? Invariably, it sits with more than one person. It might sit with some individuals with an agenda. Might not like that, but that's how it is. That's absolutely how it is.
So how can the funding model work alongside that? The BBC, as long as they are getting the license fee, they can work within that. What's it called? Within that social constraint of lots and lots of different things going on social media and lots of different news sources, etc. They can continue to do so, but how can a commercial news organisation? How can they work within that framework?
I don't. From where I'm sitting right now, I don't think they can. I think news, local. Let's talk about local news here. That provision is either, it either becomes like a charitable foundation where it's funded by entities, maybe partly by the government, maybe partly by the BBC, even that form together to fill a void. A void of perhaps local democracy. I don't know what you want to call it, but they fill a void. That could be one, but that's still trying to appeal to everyone. Or, conversely, when we touched on it, I think you find out where your niche is. Where is a niche that is unheard at the moment or unsatisfied, and try and deliver against that. And that's how I'd see it, to be honest.
And maybe another model is a very rich person comes in and says, "I want to push my agenda," and that is what I'm going to fund this newspaper or this news outlet in order to push my agenda.
Well, that's what happened in the early days of newspapers.
Of course it did.
It?
Yeah,
absolutely. And newspapers invariably were bought and sold by very rich people who became sometimes even richer on the back of them and things like that. I don't see that happening in the future in the printed media, just because I think the production costs of printed media now, and the fact that they're slow and relatively clunky, and I think there'll still be some form of printed material around, but we're seeing it happening all the time now, aren't we? Different publishers under different names, new names, brands we're not familiar with. They will emerge as trusted brands. Some of those ones, you mentioned BuzzFeed earlier, which I remember, was a cow. We all viewed it as a cowboy early doors, didn't we? And suddenly it became a real player, proper player in the market, because it knew what its audience was. You'd be disparaging about lists and things like that, but there's a place for a good listicle.
Yeah, and
we've all read them.
There must be a place for a new pub opening or a new restaurant doing good food and stuff, because that's what's all over my news feed half the time as well.
I know. Generation. What are the generations? Generation Z, Generation Alpha. I think it is now, isn't it? I think my kids are Generation Alpha. I'm not sure, but your point earlier about trust. Yeah, we trust the Times and the Sunday Times and maybe the Plymouth Herald, and we trust the Daily Mail. Well, less so the Daily Mail, but. Those names alone, if you even see them online on a search engine result or a newspaper, I inherently will trust that a bit more than that other website that I'm not that familiar with. Right? That's my generation and yours as well. My children, they're more likely to trust Mr. Beast on YouTube than what the
or
New York
someone
Times
on TikTok.
Yeah, or what the New York Times is saying.
I mean, that's come across very clearly in the Gaza conflict at the moment, of course. The young people in my group are getting all of their news about Gaza from TikTok. And it is definitely informing them in terms of bias. Without a doubt, it's definitely informing them.
Yeah.
Well, it was part of Trump's campaign, wasn't it? He deliberately avoided the established media. It's an absolute deliberate tactic not to do business with the established media and to work with, niche. I mean, they're big niches. Some of these people, like Joe Rogan, he's got a big niche, isn't he? But,
massive niche.
Into platforms.
The biggest niche you've ever seen.
And audiences. But, that's a slap in the face for the mainstream media, as I think the whole American experience has been.
Yeah. So going back to the funding model, trying to keep us on track. I'm probably not doing the best job of doing that, but I'm doing my best. What about, we did touch on the BBC. Is the BBC a problem in terms of commercial news, in that the BBC gives away its news? So, for instance, if you want to publish online, I subscribe to the Sunday Times, but why do I subscribe to the Sunday Times? Because I could just get it for free on the BBC. I do that because I like the writing in the Sunday Times. But would many people do that? Is the BBC stopping commercial news making any money? I'm thinking specifically through the website, because television and radio is a different matter, but specifically through the website, is the BBC stopping commercial organisations making money from news, from serious news?
Well, you'll find, I've been involved in many discussions about this, and there's many people involved in the local media who feel very strongly about the BBC, parking its tanks on the local press's lawn and it's unfair competition, etc., etc. I never really bought into that, because I think you've got to be realistic about our content audits. And when we found out that we were writing a lot of content that even when we offered it for free, people didn't really want to read it, or they weren't attracted to it. So I think local journalism had its own issues, regardless of what the BBC was doing. You could look at the BBC positively, which is I do. The BBC has realised there's an issue in local markets. They've collaborated with local publishers on the local democracy scheme. Really important. You could use it as a threat in the local marketplace. I don't really buy into that personally.
What do you think, Nick? I get the feeling you're not necessarily on the same page.
Well, I was listening to Bill there. I was sort of flipping my head around. I was trying to do the mental maths and I failed, right? But I still see it as a bit of a six of one and a half a dozen the other. I mean, if the BBC was suddenly paid for, as in you had to subscribe to it or whatever, or the website was so bad because there was ads everywhere that you didn't want to go on it, yeah, there'd be audience growth in some competitors. There would. But I don't believe the audience growth would be as much as the decline in revenue on, let's say, on the news publishers, because suddenly loads of advertisers want to go on the BBC website. Right? I feel that the
BBC would start taking some of the adverts
away. They take a large share
anyway
of the ad revenue. And I think that share of ad revenue would be greater than the gain in audience that they get just because the BBC's website might suddenly be average, right? Let's just say. I feel like it might... So what I'm saying is I think I agree with you. I think the BBC are probably a healthy bedfellow, probably.
Yeah, the BBC's always been around. Even back in the heydays of local journalism, that sort of thing, there were BBC newsrooms, and BBC Radio was much more involved and competitive and on the money with regards to local news and that sort of thing. They've had their own issues. So, yeah, I think Nick's used the right word there. The BBC is part of the mix.
Yeah. ITV would have a big problem with it, but we're not discussing television, are we? But they would.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, obviously. And Sky, I mean, part of the reason I say it is because I do read the Sunday Times and I am aware it's owned by Murdoch and News International. And whenever they get the chance...
You hold your nose.
Well, it is what it is, yeah. But whenever they get the chance, they do have a little pop at the BBC's funding model. And it is there almost every week. One of the journalists will talk about it. One of the commentators will talk about the BBC's funding model. And and how the BBC is biased and left wing and all of that nowadays and stuff. So it does feel like some of the newspapers out there do not appreciate the competition from the BBC, without a doubt.
No, I think you're right, and I'm not sure what that's driven by, but it's a bit pot kettle, isn't it? Because I'm a Times subscriber as well, and it's not entirely balanced, is it?
No.
The Times has a very clear agenda. It has a very clear political position.
If you read like Rod Liddell and Jeremy Clarkson, for instance, you're definitely not getting a left wing view, are you?
Yeah, exactly. You're being led down a road by those two, aren't you? But and I, like you, subscribe because I like the quality of content and that sort of thing. And it's, but have they got a problem with the BBC? If they have, that that's either coming from the editor or the owner, or I don't know,
Or from further up.
Further up.
Yeah. So bringing this one to a close, because we're coming to the end of our episode. We've got to end every episode with what's the future. So what do you see as the future, Nick?
I see the future as local news exists. I can't imagine a scenario where it doesn't exist. I just can't contemplate that.
Well, local news exists.
Yeah.
You mean local news is being reported on?
Reported news, correct. Yes. Reported news. I can't imagine a scenario where it's not reported in some way. But I believe it's got to be paid for by the greater good, whatever that looks like.
Maybe community groups.
Yeah, public service, whatever you want to badge it as, I don't know. But somebody's got to cough up money for it, or it becomes superbly focused on what it knows it's best at. It's not best at the property market. It's not best at the jobs market, but it probably is best at local democratic reporting. So I believe it's that. I'm glad, though, I'm not in a position of management in one of these companies, though.
No, anymore.
Same.
And what about you, Bill? What's your thoughts? What's the future?
I think that it's really hard to predict the future, actually, because the advances in technology are so enormous now. I think there will be things happening next year that I can't imagine now. I was with some old local radio colleagues last week. They were explaining to me some of the things that are now possible in local radio with, AI-generated voices, etc., etc. I mean, it's quite scary, but the opportunity there is enormous. So I think it's really hard to make a prediction around what will exist in 2 years, let alone 10 years' time. But in terms of local news, someone's going to be reporting it in some form. How well that is done depends.
And whether it can have any money made from it.
Yeah, I'm struggling to see, beyond Nick's, beyond that sort of classic American model of, one-man band, one guy, editing the paper on his own and doing most of the reporting and things like that and scratching himself a living. It's hard to see a future that even resembles anything we've had in the past in terms of local content. But someone or something will be doing it in some form. We'll just have to wait and see.
Thank you. That brings to an end episode 2 of the Journalists Journalism podcast. We've just made something up there. I think you just touched on AI, and I think that's probably going to be one of the themes of the next couple of episodes that we're going to be doing. It's time we talked about the future properly and where AI might lead journalism. But for now, we'll leave you, and we'll see you on episode 3.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.